Andrew Hastie, the Chinese embassy says that you must repent and redress your mistakes. What do you say to that?
Well, thanks, Peter. Look, I'm not going to repent. Senator James Paterson is not going to repent. We're members of the Liberal Party, we're backbenchers in the Commonwealth Parliament, and we're free to speak our minds on issues. We're always going to defend Australian sovereignty, our values, our interests, and we're also going to speak up for people who can't speak for themselves, like Dr. Yang Hengjun, who is still in prison in China, an Australian citizen. And also, we'll speak up for the Australian Uyghurs who have family and friends, loved ones interned in China.
The Chinese officials in Canberra issued a statement on the back of this banning of you and Senator James Paterson. And just in part, I wanted to get the language right. It says China is open to constructive dialogue and exchange with people all around the world on the basis of mutual respect, they say, equality and seeking common ground. Now, arguably, that's not going to occur if they won't allow MPs who may have a differing view on some of the big issues from visiting China. What's been the response inside the Morrison government? Have you spoken to the Prime Minister?
Peter, I'm not going to reveal who I haven't spoken to. Suffice to say, I noted the Prime Minister's comments this morning where he was supportive of James and I, you know, the government is distinct from the backbench, and I think that's very clear. Some countries don't appreciate that as much as others, but certainly we have a tradition whereby if you're a member of the cabinet here, you're bound by collective responsibility, but as a backbencher, you're free to speak your mind. But generally speaking, colleagues have been very supportive. I note Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong and Richard Di Natale and Rex Patrick, among others, have expressed concern about the Uyghurs and more generally concern about our visas not being issued by the Chinese government.
Yeah, you do say you're a member of the backbench, but the relationship with China and Australia has gotten worse at the frontbench level and the backbench level. It's been some time since a senior member of the government has been issued an invitation to visit China. I think Julie Bishop was pretty much forbidden from visiting China in the last few years of her term. The human rights dialogue that's existed between Australia and China was suspended and has not resumed since, I think, about 2014. And today we hear that another organ of cooperation between officials in both countries in relation to human rights, it's a technical cooperation program they call it, that's also now been postponed. Dennis Richardson, former head of Foreign Affairs, former departmental head of Defence, and also himself head of ASIO, he says things are getting a bit hysterical on the issue of China. He backs you in the comments you've made. He thinks the Chinese are wrong here to ban you. Doesn't banning you just amplify some of the accuracy of your comments to date?
Well, you can give speeches as a parliamentarian, you can write op-eds, you can do television interviews, radio interviews, but when you get banned from another country, I think that says a lot more than anything that you might be able to say yourself. So it is a powerful statement of where the Chinese government see James and I and our positioning. But I want to make the broader point, Peter, the world has rapidly changed in the last 5 years alone. And our generation, James and I and others, we're grappling with how to deal with the changing world around us. Of course, 1 in 3 export dollars goes to China. We do have a very strong and mutually beneficial trade relationship with China. Of course, we don't want to compromise that, but you always negotiate and do deals with people from a position of strength. And so having a strong sense of self, having a strong set of values, democratic values, Australian values, is really important. And so all our discussions come back to that point, negotiating and doing business from a position of strength and always upholding Australian sovereignty, which is critical. In the same way we respect China's sovereignty, but where our sovereignty is impinged upon, we're going to speak up, and we'll always do that.
What did you hope to achieve by going to China, and will you pursue a trip at a later stage? I note the Chinese Matters organisation say that this trip has been postponed. They clearly hold out hope that it will be rescheduled.
We've spent a lot of time in politics, Peter. You know how important door knocking is. In a sense, I wanted to go to China and talk with them in their country on their terms and learn about their history and their culture and their traditions. And I've copped a fair bit of criticism over the last few months, and partly my motivation for going was to demonstrate a willingness to engage and to have discussion. Now, we're not going to find agreement on certain issues, but I was just willing to, with an open hand, engage with the Chinese people. And I think it's really important that we do, because geography, in a sense, is destiny. And the Indo-Pacific region is going to have China for a long time, and they're going to be there. And we need to work out how we, as a democratic country, engage with China. And that was partly why I wanted to go.
You made some pointed comments just a moment ago about the Uyghurs, a Muslim population under a lot of pressure in China. You've made comments in the past about the Hong Kong protesters. I read with interest reports today published in the United States press that President Xi has instructed officials to show absolutely no mercy. I think that's the exact phrase, and to use the organs of dictatorship to bring both groups under some sort of control. Now, a lot of these were unreported speeches that have been leaked. That in itself is pretty extraordinary. You just talked about the trade relationship we have with China. Do you think that makes Australia a coward, perhaps, in speaking up on some of these issues? Do you think that the West has been complicit because of the rivers of gold coming out of China, that it's bought perhaps our silence on some of these issues?
Well, that is a really good question, and that's exactly what we should be talking about. At what price do we give silence? At what price do we sell out our values? And I'm not saying we are. I'm simply saying we need to think these things through. Now, Four Corners, when they did their episode on the Uyghurs and their internment in Xinjiang province a few months ago, mentioned some Australian companies who were sourcing cotton from that province. Now, Cotton On and Target both conducted internal inquiries, in some instances corrected where they were sourcing their cotton from, no longer from that province, and they're to be commended. So that's just one example of where Australian corporates are rethinking how they do business. And so as a country, we need to have this conversation. Prosperity absolutely is critical, but also we do have values that we hold dearly, and we also need to uphold our sovereignty. And all these things need to be taken together, and judgments need to be made.
Well, let's talk about sovereignty and a bit of international law. I've long favoured Australia conducting freedom of navigation exercises in and around the South China Sea. Today, in the Australian newspaper, ahead of a conference they're having on the issue of the strategic relationship Australia has with China, Dennis Richardson is also supportive of freedom of navigation exercises. To date, only the United States has conducted them, but he says it's not in breach of international law because these built islands that China is using as a territorial claim have no basis in international law. And Richardson said we should exercise our free will and our sovereignty and our ability to move through that area. Should we, Andrew Hastie?
Yeah, I think Dennis Richardson is absolutely right, and I speak as a backbench, not as a member of the government, but I think he's spot on there. We're a trading nation, so we depend upon lines of trade on the open seas. Now, since World War II, the US government, through the US Navy, has upheld the global rules-based order. They've protected trade, and so we need to keep those trade lines open. And so conducting a FONOPS, or a freedom of navigation operation, is one way to do that, particularly through the South China Sea, where, of course, a lot of our trade is conducted.
Some people like to push around MPs in a hope that changes their mind. It certainly does with some. Has the criticism by the Chinese and you being banned now from entering China tempered your criticisms or strengthened them in relation to speaking out on some of these issues?
Well, at a personal level, I feel like we're finally talking honestly about where we stand, and I welcome that. So I'm not going to temper what I say. Of course, you've got to think about the government and what they're trying to do. Ministers see more information, more intelligence. They have more equities to manage. So, in a sense, backbenchers have more freedom.
Well, you see a fair bit
in
your role on that committee, though, Andrew. You see a fair bit of intelligence. I know that from the past, chairing the Intelligence Committee of the Parliament. So you would be well placed in your criticisms.
That's right. And so my point was, I'm not going to temper. I'm not going to back away from what I've written or said in the past. and I'm elected by the people of Canning to stand up for Australian interests, which I'll always do. So, and being the chair of the PJCIS does give me greater insight by virtue of the fact that I have access to information, which I need to protect, obviously, but it means that I can speak uniquely into this space, so I will do that at appropriate times.
Look, just before we go, on Friday, Ben Roberts-Smith came out and said, a VC recipient, as many Australians know, came out and said he could no longer, in good conscience, recommend to anyone that they join the Australian military. You've similarly served in uniform. What would your response to a young person be if they asked you that same question?
I'm deeply grateful to the Australian Defence Force, the Australian Army in particular, for the opportunities I've received going through the Australian Defence Force Academy, being educated at the tertiary level, going through Duntroon, and then having the opportunity to lead Australian soldiers both here and overseas. There are a lot of young kids in my electorate who I encourage to join the Army, Navy and Air Force, whether for leadership or whether just to be a digger or an airman or a sailor. I say join up, it's a great opportunity, go and see the world, serve your country. And so my view is nothing has changed. The ADF is a great place to start your life as an adult, and I recommend it to all.
Andrew Hastie, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Peter.